Between Resident Evil 1 and 2, the biggest problem I've had is how overly simple the games are. I mean, I get it, there's not a whole lot you can do with tank controls, but when the typical boss fight is just hit and run, it does make the combat seem a little pointless. Here is where Resident Evil 3 shines, and what makes it the best classic-style Resident Evil game I've played yet. The combat has been overhauled, there's a mild item and enemy randomizer built into the game, and mastery of the game's controls is a necessity for this one. If you love these tank control horror games and you've never played Resident Evil 3, then you are doing yourself a serious disservice. The story starts off just before Resident Evil 2. While Leon and Claire showed up after the zombie outbreak had already been well underway, Resident Evil 3 takes place right when the chaos is at its peak. Both the local police and Umbrella's mercenary force are useless to push back the zombie horde, and Jill Valentine of the local special police force STARS finds herself in the middle of the city fighting for survival. Along the way, she bumps into Carlos, an Umbrella mercenary, and the two team up.
Wait, I have to ask you something.
I know. You wanna ask me out? All the foxy ladies love my accent. It drives them crazy.
What? Keep dreaming.
But Umbrella has also launched their deadly new tyrant monster, Nemesis, whose mission it is to track down and eliminate all surviving STARS members, as they know the truth back from the first Resident Evil game.
Listen, he's coming for us. We're both gonna die.
What are you saying?
You'll see. He's after STARS members. There's no escape.
I feel like the story isn't as strong as it was with Resident Evil 2. Leon, Claire, Ada, and Sherry had a really good dynamic between them, and there were plenty of other interesting side characters as well. In Resident Evil 3, all you have are Jill, Carlos, and Nemesis. And there's Nikolai as well, but he doesn't really do that much. The voice acting is okay, more or less on par with Resident Evil 2, although there is the occasional questionable line of dialogue.
Hey, is someone wounded back there? Oh, this looks bad.
If you're up to speed with the previous Resident Evil games, then this is familiar territory. Avoid zombies using awkward controls, hug the walls while mashing X to search for items, and solve the occasional puzzle while managing your limited inventory. Resident Evil 3 is unique in comparison to the previous two games in that there is only one scenario to play through. This isn't too much of a loss though, as those multiple scenarios were basically just slightly arranged variations of each other, and the single campaign that Jill has to go through here is really good on its own. This is also the first Resident Evil game to ditch the idea of focusing on exploring a single massive building. In the first game there was the mansion, and in the second one the police station. But Resident Evil 3 mainly takes place across the Raccoon City streets, along with a couple of medium-sized buildings later on. Part of what made the previous two games really special to me was how the map would circle around back to itself, and backtracking through familiar halls would remain deadly as zombies left behind would stick around, or they would be replaced by deadlier threats. With Resident Evil 3, much of it comes down to running along narrow streets and the occasional fork in the road. There is some backtracking, sure, but there's no real central hub, and areas get exhausted of their use rather quickly. This is the biggest disappointment of Resident Evil 3 for me by far. The level design isn't nearly as strong as in the previous two games. By the same token though, it is interesting how this complements the faster pace of the game, which relies much more so on being action-packed and moving quickly through new areas. The big new addition here is the dodge mechanic, in which Jill can avoid enemy attacks with proper timing. This is so awesome to pull off and makes each battle feel so much more dynamic. Although, there are a couple of major complaints that I have with this. The big one being that the player doesn't gain any invulnerability from doing this maneuver. That means that even with a successful dodge, it's still possible to get hit anyway. This is compounded by the fact that the player doesn't get to choose their dodge either. Jill simply maneuvers in a random manner. This makes it particularly dangerous to try to dodge with your back against the wall. If Jill decides to back up instead of moving left or right, then she's not going anywhere. This wouldn't be so bad if dodging could be left to a last-minute desperation move, but Nemesis moves so fast that he doesn't give you any breathing room. Hit and run tactics don't work out so well either because he eventually gets fed up with your shenanigans and just starts gunning for you. I find what's best is to stand my ground in an open area and just hope for the best. I'm going to take hits half the time, and I'm probably going to need 2 full heals by the end of the fight, but I find that it still works better than anything else I can come up with. However, perhaps even worse than a vulnerable dodge is an unwanted dodge. This seems to mostly occur with the dog enemies, and it can bring an easy battle down to an absolute pain. It really doesn't help that the command for dodging is the same exact command for attacking. So accidentally dodging when you meant to attack, or vice versa, attacking when you really wanted to dodge, just makes the game feel really obnoxious. With that being said, I would still much rather have the dodge mechanic as is than not at all. It adds a layer of depth that the previous 2 games were so desperately missing, and the timing windows for the dodges is large enough that it can be pulled off consistently and with intention, with the more delayed and awkward attacks meant to throw off the player's timing. I do find the zombie grabs extremely difficult to use this action dodge against, but they're also really slow and easy to predict enemies, so that balances itself out pretty well. Another new addition that makes a huge difference is the minor randomization. Each time the player enters an area, there's a good chance that certain enemies or items will be different, or not show up at all. A big part of what makes Resident Evil 2 so easy is that it can be memorized, while Resident Evil 3 throws a wrench in those plans. It does feel like a really odd implementation in a lot of ways. I'm not sure if the randomized items balance themselves out very well, if at all, and it makes me want to save scum in order to make sure that I'm not missing out on an extra set of gunpowder. On the other hand, and more importantly, it prevents the game from becoming stale, especially as the player attempts to challenge themselves with fewer saves and faster times in order to improve their ranking. And besides, if the way I ended my game with 72 Magnum rounds and other various supplies is anything to go by, there's still plenty of ammo to go around. It's just that players can't always rely on getting the exact amount in the same exact places anymore. By now, it's time I brought up the star of the show. Nemesis is special here in that he's designed to follow the player around from room to room, acting as a relentless threat until he's finally put down and the player is rewarded for it. Or the player simply deals with him hanging around, dodging his attacks and running to safety. Nemesis is an awesome idea, but it's not pulled off quite as well as it might initially seem. For starters, Nemesis doesn't really follow you from room to room. Instead, there are select areas that Nemesis may or may not show up in. Namely, save rooms and rooms with puzzles are free of Nemesis harassment. But this can get really obnoxious as you rarely get the chance to lead Nemesis to an open area. The guy will almost only show up in alleyways.
Stars.
Furthermore, while you are awarded with powerful weapons and items for defeating Nemesis, it's also possible to get such rewards via choices made during cutscenes. It's a shame because the alternate choice in these cutscenes is almost always significantly worse, so it's just a guessing game for the first playthrough, and there's pretty much no reason to ever choose the alternate path, unless maybe you feel like challenging yourself or something. Still, fighting against Nemesis is awesome. He's a legitimate threat, and timing dodges against him feels so cool, even if it doesn't always work out. It is an absolute pain that he's able to kill you in one shot if you're an orange caution, and he's also able to combo you to death from as high as yellow caution if you're unlucky. But I think it's something you kind of get used to with practice. You just have to be particularly generous with your healing items, which feels really wrong to me, but I do feel like it kind of works out in the end. It's also not uncommon for Nemesis to get himself stuck on a wall and leave himself open to free attacks. but I can excuse this for the age of the game, and overall, I think there are more pros than cons surrounding Nemesis' artificial intelligence and the way that he's implemented into the game. I should mention that the new weapons earned from defeating Nemesis are ridiculous, and they break the game pretty hard. The alternate handgun is nuts. It can hold its own against pretty much anything, even the hunters late in the game. It is pretty random though, you have to get lucky to get a kill with one shot. But even without considering that, it fires very quickly, it reloads almost instantly, and it still does decent damage. You're still gonna want to use shotguns and stronger weapons against the hunters, but until they show up, you rarely need to consider bringing anything along other than your pistol. Unless Nemesis is gonna be involved, of course. It's a bit of an odd deviation away from the established Resident Evil formula of needing the right weapon for the right job. The Eagle 6.0 pistol pretty much handles 75 to 80% of the game on its own. Another really cool addition is the ability to craft ammunition. By mixing different gunpowder found throughout the game, the player can choose what kind of ammo they want instead of relying entirely on what the game gives them. I'm not happy that the game doesn't explain some of the more unusual combinations, with the only hint being a line in the instruction booklet that reads, "With certain combinations, you can create very powerful bullets." So experimentation is encouraged, but things like creating shotgun ammo from weaker gunpowder is such a powerful option for the player to have that I feel like it deserves a direct explanation. As usual, there's an additional mode to complement the game's short runtime. It's the legendary Mercenaries mode. This is where it all began before it got super popular with Resident Evil 4 and beyond. But this one isn't quite like how Mercenaries would evolve in the later entries. Here, the player must make it from point A to point B, killing zombies and rescuing survivors along the way to extend the timer. It's a cool variation on Extreme Battle Mode that's a little faster paced. Unfortunately, there's not much else. I guess this version of Mercenaries kind of works as a de facto fourth survivor as well, so I'll concede and it's not too bad. I do feel like there are a few major flaws with Resident Evil 3. The level design, unreliable dodging, and the lack of enemy variety hurt the game quite a bit. Or perhaps not so much lack of enemy variety per se, but rather how easy it is to deal with most of them using only the pistol. And of course, the giant spiders are still so easy to run past that they're still just as threatening as they were in the previous game. However, the positives far outweigh the negatives. Nemesis feels like a terrible pain at first, but once you learn how to deal with them, he's the best boss out of the entire trilogy. It's a shame this game doesn't have a whole lot of other bosses, but whatever, Nemesis alone is awesome. The enemy and item randomization go a long way to making each playthrough exciting, and the alternate paths made through the cutscene choices, while minor, do add some neat replay value. All of this puts Resident Evil 3 in a league far above 1 and 2, but this should also come with a warning of it being brutally difficult. I would highly recommend Resident Evil 2 as someone's first foray into the franchise, but if you want more and you're ready for a greater challenge, then Resident Evil 3 has you covered. Thanks for watching my review on Resident Evil 3. I'm looking forward to the remake coming soon, and if the previous remake was anything to go by, then this one should be excellent.